Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our final episode talking about museums and institutions. We've talked a lot this week about how museums really present a space and present a visual narrative that activates a specific practice of viewing in audiences. In particular, that there's really one history of art, that there's especially one that features the art of Europe and the US quite prominently against all other objects and cultures from around the world. Also, how it presents actual audiences, their bodies, with very specific ways of moving around art museums and very much limiting their amount of interaction with what they are seeing. And today we are looking at artists, right? We haven't talked about them this week on how artists themselves use their art, their artistry, to critique that same history, to critique the museum, and to critique the certain problematic aspects of the art world in general, especially related to its history, how it's run administratively, and certain museum decisions through time. And so today we are going to be looking at a few artists who do this, and I'm calling this Mining the Museum. And I take this title from a very impactful, important work called Mining the Museum by artist Fred Wilson that was extremely groundbreaking for this whole idea of how do artists critique institutions? Why do they critique institutions? And how can they use the museum space itself as a means and method for that critique? So these are the things we're going to be thinking about today. And you'll be able to answer and discuss the following questions. How do artists put forward the idea that the art world will not change unless the museum structure changes? So mining the museum means that we're not going to critique it outside. We're going to go inside, and that is where we're going to stage the critique. And there's this idea that that is what needs to be done. The change needs to come from the inside at the base level for certain changes to happen outward. Second, how can an artist museum collaboration be used as a means for an institutional critique? And so this is going directly relating to Fred Wilson's artwork, Mining the Museum, because for his type of practice, collaboration with museum professionals is in the institution itself is key. The museum has to be open to the critique for it to be most successful. And lastly, what are some possible difficulties of institutional critique in art? And open-ended question here for you guys to consider. I think that the artworks that I'm going to show you that show this type of institutional critique are very engaging and interesting. But like interactivity in gallery designs that we talked about in the last episode, there is this idea of, well, if I just stage a critique, and people are get really interested in it and people think it's groundbreaking, does it actually change? Because once this artwork is over, the museum returns to business as normal. Does it actually have larger effects? Does it actually make structural changes? And that's something for you guys to consider. It's totally open-ended. So institutional critique and Mining the Museum. And Mining the Museum is a version of institutional critique, but we'll get to that later on. Definition of this type of art. It is a form of conceptual art, and conceptual art is art where the idea behind what is happening is more important than necessarily the visual form or the physical form. And so it makes sense, institutional critique, artists interested in this, it is very conceptual because you are engaging in an argument, a debate. This is a debate of ideas within a space, and you are performing something, and that is important, but it's what's behind it. What is the meaning? And that is at the heart of conceptual art. And this art movement emerged in the late 1960s. It's been around for a long time, and mainly centered on critiquing museums, galleries, private collections, and other art institutions. Artists working in this vein use a range of strategies to expose the ideologies and power structures underlining the circulation, display, and discussion of art. So I am ending our discussion of museums with this episode because I think it couples really well with episode 1 when we talked about the types of ideologies museums traditionally have presented to audiences, the power structures that have been underlying just the creation of museums, and especially how objects are displayed, put together, circulated, discussed, all feed into this very large institution that is all about power and authority. And so that's institutional critique in general. So I've been around for a very long time, and I have some examples. But when we're talking about mining the museum, it's a form of institutional critique, but one in which he very groundbreakingly went in to the museum's storage space, like the permanent collection, and he does this in different institutions around the country, around the world, and he goes in not knowing what he's going to find, but he really likes to think about what a collection, all the stuff that is inside museums, that museums collect, that they display only a small fraction of it out for audiences. But for him, mining the museum, what can I find? What objects can I find? And putting them next to each other will create a different sense of history, a different sense of what this art means to audiences. And the first time he did this practice, mining the museum, was in 1992 to 1993. A year-long exhibition. It was so popular that they made it a year-long installation at the Maryland Historical Society. And like I said, he used the institution's collection and gallery space to highlight the legacies, specifically here, of racial violence and the erasure, and how this is erased in traditional art displays. Wilson's exhibition used a methodology that sought to create an effective response in viewers, right? So one of the goals is to not only expose the histories that museums may not want to include or might not want to think about in relationship to other art objects, but he's also interested in making an getting an emotional response to viewers of maybe shock or maybe discomfort, right? And that's all about putting objects that we don't expect to be next to each other. And we as an audience member are being asked to figure out what that new meaning is. What is this comparison that he's making? And sometimes it's shocking, and sometimes it's confusing, and we don't necessarily understand what's going on. But it does affect us some way. And his whole idea is that he's challenging the normal way of seeing objects in a museum gallery, that we just absorb it and we don't ask questions. He wants us to ask questions, and he wants us to get emotionally involved with objects that we see. So our first example of early institutional critique in art that's very conceptual is Robert Barry's inert gas series, helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, from a measured volume to indefinite expansion. You can already tell by that long title that it is probably a conceptual art piece. And I really like this series. I've written about it a little bit, but the whole idea that Barry was doing is that his whole art piece, if we call it an art piece, was releasing inert gases, so helium, neon, argon, etc., just out in places around the country. in LA, New York City. He just released these gases, which you can't see, right? So, so it's very difficult if we're thinking about it as an art object to handle it, because there's no way, it's just gas that you can't see. So already Robert Barry in Inert Gas series is critiquing the idea of what is the traditional art object. The traditional art object is something that you can display, that can be seen, that it's tangible. But what if it's something you can't see? What if it's ephemeral? What if it's everywhere? And that's one way that he was critiquing the art world at the time. The only way to document this, you could call it performance, you call it a piece, a conceptual art piece, was to take a picture of the release. And so all you get is just a picture of a neighborhood or a picture of Central Park. And he says, I released Argon, you can't see it. But to promote this series, since there really isn't anything to show, he used this blank piece of just paper, right? And it just had, the art piece, the title down here. And this was how he advertised his artworks. This is how it was displayed in the gallery space. And this was considered very groundbreaking. His New York art dealer, Seth Siegelaub, who stated he was doing something, he has done something and it's definitely changing the world. However, I can't speak right now. He has put something into the world, but you just can't see it or measure it, something real but imperceptible, right? And so this is a great idea, thinking about our question about how things need to be changed internally within the art world. There's this idea that you need to change the way objects are displayed, what types of objects are displayable or valuable. How can an art dealer sell something like the releasing inert gas? Right, even the basic economics of the art world, of an active artist, is that you have people buying your art, people collecting your art, but it's impossible. And so it's a very small idea. It's a small act, but it has huge consequences for thinking about the institution. Another early institutional critique artist is Hans Haacke. And he is an artist where many of his works deal with that. It's very much part of his entire practice as an artist. And so he was a pioneer of institutional critique. He was particularly interested in how the art world connects with money and politics and space, right? Thinking about all of these gallery spaces in New York City during the 70s were downtown, owned by landlords, that some of them were, taking bribes. And he was really just thinking about the corruption within the art world based upon money and politics. And he was scheduled to have a show at the Guggenheim Museum in 1971. The Guggenheim, big time museum in New York City. And it featured these works right here, where he went to these different building sites around the Guggenheim, around the art galleries, and he had write-ups about how he researched the shady dealings of different landlords of these buildings. And the Guggenheim heard that this was going to be part of the show, and they actually canceled the entire exhibition because they feared that one of these landlords would sue the museum for slander. And so what happened here is we have an example of censorship, right? The Guggenheim specifically censoring Hans Haacke's artworks because of the institutional critique. And this goes to the question of one of the possible pitfalls of institutional critique is that the institution might not like the critique that you're putting forward, and they have the power to censor you. They have the authority to say you're not going to have a big exhibition anymore, or an art dealer could cancel your contract. And so you have the ability to really piss people off, and that has consequences. But for someone like Hans Haacke, being censored is not a huge deal. Probably something that he really liked, saying, look, my artwork is doing its job, right? It is breaking apart the institution from the inside. See how they get so defensive about certain ideas that are within its walls. So we can see both sides of the coin, that it is doing the job, but then there are pitfalls because you might not be able to do this type of work elsewhere. Other institutions might not want to have you in their collection or have you as an exhibition because they've heard your reputation. And so it goes both ways. And then we have Andrea Fraser, another artist working in the 80s and 90s, who staged a lot of institutional critique performances within museums. She also did video work, so she's a very multimedia type of artist. And in these two are two different works that have the same premise. These are videos that she made. One of them was called Museum Highlights, a gallery talk from 1989. And then the other one was The Public Life of Art, the Museum. And the whole idea of both of these videos is that Fraser she's acting as a museum docent. And museum docents are usually volunteers who are really interested in art, that are trained to go around and give tours and talk about the history of art. And so they very much are the voice of the museum and the curator as volunteers. And she's posing as one of them. She gives herself a fake name, and she acts like she's giving a video tour of a museum, an actual museum. She actually goes into different museums and looks around. But once you watch her videos, she says a lot of interesting things, and she says it in the style of a docent. Docents are trained to be very engaging, very dynamic public speakers. They say a lot of words like, well, this is the best, and this is the most beautiful, and very performative. And so she very much hams it up. She goes a little bit overboard with that kind of docent-like speak. And and by doing that, she's kind of making fun of this process of docents, and we need to listen to them and follow them around when they give us tours. And she'll even point to non-art objects in her videos, say an exit sign or a fire hose hookup, or even a water fountain, just a regular water fountain, not an art object. And she'll say, look at this wonderful piece here. This is a brilliant example of a brilliant school, a brilliant movement. And is really meant to show the absurdity of not only the narrative that the museums want you to kind of blindly follow, but also the objects within the museum, that anything basically could displayed on a wall is considered art, but maybe it's not actually, right? Maybe a fire, like an exit sign, is an art object because it's displayed in a museum. So really thinking about and critiquing the gallery space as a place of authority. And then we have mining the museum. And like I said, Fred Wilson went into the Maryland Historical Society in their collection and was given free rein to create different vignettes, different combinations of objects. And this goes to our question of collaboration. Something like mining the museum really only works very well when the museum is on board, and they know, right? They know that Fred Wilson is going to present a new narrative that might be unsettling, that it's going to critique the museum itself. And so museums do this because Fred Wilson is the conversations that he presents are very powerful and needed, but it is also a way to show audiences, hey, we know about maybe a problematic history, or we know that we have objects in the collection that we purposely don't show because we might not want to feature those histories as prominently as other histories. And they're saying, but we are okay. We're open to critique. See, we are changing from within. And so Wilson, when talking about his Mining the Museum projects, is that he says, my projects are only as good as the relationships I build, right? And saying that, him as an artist and doing this practice relies on collaboration, but also the museum saying being open to institutional critique. And so let's see an example of one of these vignettes that he did in 1992. And he was really interested in materials. So these vignettes are taken from different practices within decorative and material art. So here we have metalwork from 1793 to 1880. And he's thinking about metalwork. He has examples of this very elaborate silver set that you can imagine a very wealthy person in Maryland from the colonial past would have. But then he also has this in the center, also made from silver. In this right here, you might not realize what it is, but what it is next to this is shackles used on enslaved peoples during the same time in Maryland. And so by putting these together, and in a regular type of display, right? A normative display at the Maryland Museum would probably just have this silver set, right? To show, oh, this is what wealthy plantation owners had in their, in their houses. But what he's doing is he's adding this element, which is showing, right, quite dramatically and in very moving way that the money, right, the prestige that allowed for this, right, was built on the backs of enslaved peoples that were in the same environment. And so commenting on the Maryland's history, Maryland had plenty of plantations and involved in the enslavement of Africans, and that this history isn't something that's usually shown in this particular institution. Similarly, we have a example of woodwork, right? So we went from woodwork, metalwork to now woodwork, cabinet making from a similar period of time. And so in this work, we have all of these different chairs that he found in the collection from different time periods, probably very antiques, made by important wood makers during the time. And so he is really thinking about how to, he's really creating this installation of all of these different examples of woodwork, and they look like they are put together as an audience, right? You'd almost imagine that they set up for some sort of performance, and you are meant to sit on and look. But what are they looking at? They're looking at this object, which is also made out of wood, and this object is a actual whipping stand that was used to torture enslaved peoples during the colonial era in Maryland. And so the similar type to metalwork, he's really giving a very, very, very striking contrast, and how he is showcasing that this is meant to be for an audience. It's meant to be for amusement. He's saying something about the racial violence during that time. And even a larger goal of a work like this is really confronting the idea that a museum is a microcosm for a society. And we talked about this in episode 1, where there was an idea, the idea of a museum, the goal of a museum is to present its objects in a certain narrative, in a certain timeline that reflects the outside world and how things are and were existing. But he's saying here, often that microcosm isn't necessarily as accurate or as truthful as it might want to seem, right? So you might get a very long history of woodworking in the colonial period, but that doesn't include the creation of these whipping posts, right? So that is not typically part of that narrative. And then here we have the last example that I have from Mining of the Museum. And here we have a collection of these wooden statues that are very typical very traditional outside of tobacco shops. And sometimes you will even see them still. You'll know that when it was a sign that, this is a tobacco shop, you can get, leaf tobacco, cigars, you can buy tobacco pipes, etc. And so it was a signal, much like, in barber shops, they have the red, white, and blue stripe. It signaled that this is a tobacconist. But typically, these statues showcased a very stereotypical image of an indigenous person, and so these objects are very much already critiqued as being very stereotypical, and the idea of the indigenous communities, the relation to tobacco and like peace pipe is just a very stereotypical narrative and image. But what he's doing, right, he's putting them together. A lot of people would probably recognize what these are, but he's turning them away, right? He's turning them away from the audience, because usually they're there in front of a building beckoning people in, right? And usually the statues have hands that have tobacco leaves in them, right? So he's shifting that narrative. He's saying this isn't this kind of stereotypical welcoming indigenous person. No, we are kind of rejecting it by turning it away in a way that it wasn't really meant to be used. And so Wilson's method shows that by changing the perception of us when viewing objects, or the perception of these objects within the gallery space, or how the curators would put these objects typically, is showing that we can reject the ways in which museums and galleries create this sense of sameness. He calls it solace and sameness within the culture. There's this idea that histories are very much watered down. That they don't necessarily talk about how violence has been part of histories, how violence has been enacted on different peoples with different histories and cultures, and very much is there. The museum is there. Traditional museums are there to reassure audiences about the status quos of society. And he says that's not really reflective of history or what museums have in their collections. And by putting different things together and moving things around, he is very literally critiquing the museum from the deep, 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 deep inside. This is the last image for today of a more contemporary artist who's really thinking about mining the museum. And Wilson's practice had great effect on other artists. And Mark Dion, who is very interested in environments, very interested in environmental science, environmental issues, and specifically pollution of the air and of marine environments. And so here he has a cabinet of marine debris. And so Mark Dion I really like Mark Dion because he recalls so many different histories of the museum. this should look like a cabinet of curiosity to you guys, and it's meant to, because he's hearkening to the history of this collection of things that are meant to be just curious, and you should just be in awe of them. But it's of marine debris. It's of trash that he has found on beaches, and his practice is very much, he goes into communities and spaces, and he takes artifacts or trash, etc., from these spaces, so it does reflect a local community, and he'll put them in these elaborate cabinets. And he's really confronting, right? He's mining almost the environment itself to showcase certain problems that he sees with, trash, pollution. How do we think about nature? We think about nature. We want it, to be pure and untouched, but yet we fill it with so much debris and trash, which are things that we don't actually have awe and wonder when you see a land